Good morning, everyone. I'm Lee Bentley, the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Florida. I want to thank the members of the press for being here today. I want to welcome Ron Davis to our district. He is the Executive Director of COPS, the Community-Oriented Policing Services. I'd also like to welcome here into our office our good friend, Mayor Bob Buckhorn, Mayor of Tampa, of course, and Police Chief Eric Ward. We're here today because approximately 1 year ago, I received a phone call from then Chief Jane Castor of TPD. She realized that the bicycling tickets that were being handed out in Tampa had a disparate impact. She realized that a higher percentage of black riders were being stopped and ticketed than white riders, and she wasn't happy about it. She realized that this was something that had been implemented as a law enforcement tool with very good intent, and it was being perceived by some as discriminatory. And she asked the Department of Justice to do what it could to help evaluate what TPD was doing. It was purely voluntary on the part of then Chief Castor and Mayor Buckley, who supported her request. Over the past year, Ron Davis and his office, COPS, have worked very closely with the City of Tampa, both the Mayor's office and, of course, the Police Department. They've come up with some very detailed findings that are in a report that you all have. And Executive Director Davis is going to talk a little bit about the findings in those reports and recommendations that we made. And the Mayor and the Police Chief are then going to talk to you about what they've drawn from the report. There are several points, though, before I turn it over to them that I want to stress. The City of Tampa and the Police Department here has a very close relationship with our office. TPD has been one of the primest partners we've had in law enforcement over the years. It's a model department. The reason you're here today is because TPD voluntarily chose to bring DOJ in to ask if what it was doing could be improved. And the findings that you'll hear more about make it very clear that although the bicycle ticketing had a racially disparate impact, it was not discriminatory. There was absolutely no intent on the part of TPD to discriminate on the basis of the race. On the basis of race. No discriminatory intent whatsoever. It's also clear that many people in the community, including the most affected communities, predominantly African Americans, supported what TPD was doing. But TPD decided that on the basis of the the racially disparate impact, that it wanted to try to improve what it's doing, and that's what we're here to discuss further today. Now, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Executive Director Ron Davis of COPS. Mr. Davis has a long history in law enforcement. After serving in the military, he spent 20 years with the Oakland, California Police Department, and following that for 8 years, he was the Chief of Police in East Palo Alto, California. He's been the Director of COPS since November 2013, and he's working with police departments all over the country to improve what they're doing in the way of community policing. So with no further ado, Ron Davis.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lee. So bear with me. I'm going to walk through some of the findings, but I'm also going to turn over to one of the experts on our assessment team to get more into details, and then later we'll be able to ask questions about that. Let me start by thanking again the mayor and the police chief for a couple of things. One, for being here today, and two, going back to last year, you heard the U.S. Attorney mention this, asking for this assessment. Now, at the time, former Police Chief Jane Castor called. Let me tell you about the thought process that went through my mind before we said yes, because obviously spending a year doing analysis, bringing the top experts in around the country to do this analysis was an investment on behalf of the United States Department of Justice. When Chief Castor called, I said yes to the mayor to the chief's request for a couple of reasons. One, we always want to support progressive leadership when police departments are trying to work with their community to address a problem. Two, this specific challenge, the idea of how you fight crime while ensuring equity in the administration of justice and that you don't have disparate outcomes, is one that is a challenge being faced in every major city and even small city around the country. This is a national challenge. And in that regard, Tampa is not unique. What Tampa is unique in is wanting to have an assessment to come in to take a look so that we can identify if there were disparities, why they exist, and if they did exist, what steps can be taken to ensure that they don't continue to exist or that we don't implement programs that have the disparities. I like to, if you think about it, the time that Chief Castor asked for this assessment, I'm aware of locally there was a lot of media, there's a lot of data out there, but it still took a lot of courageous leadership to ask the federal government to come in and open your department up for an assessment. My favorite phrase when chiefs do this is, most chiefs understand that the truth can hurt, but selective ignorance is fatal. And the idea that you would bury your head and pretend like nothing's happening when the community around you is giving a very loud voice telling you that there's a problem, then moral leadership requires that you step up to the plate and ask for such an assessment. So that's why we're here. So I want to start by also thanking our partners in this assessment, the Virginia Center for Policing Innovation, who you'll hear from. They provided the experts, the analysis, the interviews, and the important pieces of the work of the assessment that you're reading. Now, this assessment included a comprehensive analysis of bicycle law enforcement focusing on bike stops and citations in Tampa. The team conducted interviews with police officers and residents, did document review, data analysis, and as you recall, held an opening listening session. We got technical data from the police department on bicycle stops, citation, crashes involving injuries, calls for service, crime mapping and data. And in short, the department did, I think our experts did a tremendous job in sifting through all documents and data, interviews, perceptions, community feedback to come up with the analysis. Now, let me tell you some basic summaries of the analysis, and I'll turn it over to my colleague to get into more of the details, but I think what stands out. First, as you did hear, the assessment found that the number of black bicyclists stopped by the police department greatly exceeded that of white bicyclists. Now, in doing this assessment, we use bicycle crashes as a proxy for the population of bicycle riders in Tampa. We found that whites make up 49% of bicycle crashes, but only account for 26% of the actual stops. And blacks make up 40% of the bicycle crashes, but accounted for 73% of the stops. Among stop cyclists, black bicyclists were more likely to receive a formal citation than white bicyclists. The team could not determine whether they observed racial disparities, and we do not believe that there were any racial disparities, or I would say discriminatory actions, but we would like to see additional data in the future to get a better analysis of exactly what that means. The data clearly showed that significant disparities in stops and ticketing practices exist, although, as I stated before, these disparities do not appear to be intentional. Now, the police department, when initially looking at this data, offered that the purpose of the bicycle stops were threefold. One, to improve bicycle safety. Two, to reduce bicycle theft. Three, to prevent crimes in high crime areas using stops as a part of a proactive policing strategy. I'll summarize this and then turn it to Ajamar to get into the details, but our assessment, our analysis, showed that those goals of the program were not met. The data did not validate any three of those reasons offered while the stops were conducted. In short, the team found that the bicycle stops were not effective in reducing crime. They were not effective in recovering stolen bicycles or preventing bicycle thefts, and they were not really effective in increasing bicycle safety. What it did do unintentionally is have a disparate impact on people of color riding bikes in Tampa, and it also would then strain the relationship between the police and the community. I'm going to stop there and come back. I want to turn over to our lead, one of the lead researchers that took a look at it so he can provide you the context of how we came up with this analysis, what it means, and some next stops. So at that point, I'm going to turn over to Ajamar.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ojamar Mitchell. I'm Associate Professor at the University of South Florida in the Criminology Department. I am one of the subject matter experts hired by the CPI to conduct this research. I've been asked very briefly to provide an overview of methodology, findings, and recommendations of the report. I'm going to start by talking about the data. We collected extensive data quantitative and qualitative in TPD largely. Quantitative data includes number of bike stops, number of bike crashes, the location of both, crime in general, bike thefts specifically. Combine those data with qualitative data we collected on our own. We interviewed many members of TPD, many community members. We use these data to address 3 specific questions. The first specific question, and really before I talk about the question we analyzed, I want to point out something very important about the data. TPD's data is great for their purposes, but for research purposes, they are less than ideal. One significant flaw with the data, quantitative data, is that not all bike stops were documented prior to the publication of TPD's result. Another significant flaw of the data for our purposes is we don't have good information about the ethnicity of those stopped. We simply have black or white. We don't know if they're Hispanic or any other ethnic group. Third, the reasons listed in the data for the bike stop are very sparse. So we don't have great detail about why an individual stopped. Now going back to the 3 questions we analyzed, the first and most fundamental question we analyzed is, are there racial disparities in bike stops? To address this question, we use bike crashes as a benchmark. It is very important in any racial disparity, any racial profiling research to have a valid and appropriate benchmark. We use bike crashes as a benchmark because our logic is that bike crashes are largely random events, and therefore they will reflect the racial distribution of those biking in that area. Second, to the extent that bike crashes are not random, those who ride their bikes more dangerously are more likely to be involved in the crash and more likely to be stopped for bike violations. So as a starter, we use bike crashes as our benchmark, the logic being, if the percentage of African Americans stopped in a particular area matches the percentage of African Americans involved in a crash in the same area, then that would be an evidence of no racial disparity. On the other hand, if the percentage of African Americans stopped in a particular area greatly exceeds the percentage of African Americans involved in a crash in that same area, that is evidence of racial disparity. In fact, we find there is significant racial disparity. 73% of those stopped in Tampa were African Americans, yet only 40% of those involved in bike crashes were African American. Further, we find that the racial disparities, the overrepresentation of blacks among those stopped, is somewhat higher in high crime areas. Further still, we find that certain areas of the city, typically high crime areas, had much greater levels of bike stops than other areas of the city. This leads us to our second question. What explains the variation in the number of bike stops across the city? Our interviews with TPD suggest there are 3 reasons for this variation. The first is because Tampa PD is pursuing greater bike safety. In other words, areas with greater numbers of bike crashes will have a greater number of bike stops in order to improve the safety in that area. Second explanation is bike thefts are a significant problem in Tampa. So the areas where bike thefts are a problem will have more bike stops. Third, TPD uses bike stops as a general method of reducing crime and as a method of reducing bike thefts in particular. We found that when we compared the location of where bike crashes are most likely to occur and where bike stops are more likely to occur, there was a spatial mismatch between the two. In other words, the variation in bike stops is poorly explained by variation in bike crashes across the state. Likewise, bike stops are not highly correlated with the number of bike thefts in a particular area. Again, there's a spatial mismatch. However, we found that bike stops are highly correlated with crime in a particular community. The higher the crime, the more likely there are to be a greater frequency of bike stops. The third question we addressed is what effect do bike stops have on crime in Tampa generally, and specifically bike thefts. One of the interesting findings of this report is that after the TBT study came out, the number of bike stops in Tampa dropped precipitously and rapidly. This allows us to use a natural experimental design to compare the effect of crime in Tampa before and after the story, before and after the bike stops dropped. If bike stops by themselves are an important crime fighting tool, then after the bike stops went down, crime should go up. We found, however, crime did not vary significantly before and after the story came out. Specifically, there was a 4% increase in Part 1 crimes after Tampa reduced the number of bike stops being made. That 4% reduction is not statistically significant, meaning that in statistical terms, the crime rates are identical before and after the story came out. Qualitative data are very interesting because they give context to these findings. Qualitatively, our interviews with Tampa Bay, TPD officers indicate they were using bike stops largely to promote public safety in areas of the city that are most in need of public safety, those with high crime rates. Likewise, our interviews with community members, while not uniform, there was a pattern of community members expressing support for Tampa Bay's TPD's bike program and their proactive approach more generally. Based on these findings, we have a list of 20 recommendations in the report. I won't go over all of them, but I will simply note those recommendations fall into 3 distinct categories. First, we have some recommendations about data collection and data analysis. We have recommendations regarding operations and community engagement. I will mention a couple of the recommendations in detail. Perhaps first and most fundamental, we recommend that TPD reduce the number of bike stops being made. This recommendation is based on the fact that bike stops, by our analysis, do not reduce crime. There's a spatial mismatch between where they're being used and the problems they're trying to address. And there is a perception in parts of the community that believe this practice is racially biased. Therefore, we've asked TPD, we've recommended to TPD that they reduce the number of bike stops. Second, we asked TPD to document more carefully the reasons for a bike stop, the ethnicity of those involved in the bike stop. Third, we recommend greater monitoring of racial disparities in bike stops going forward. Fourth and finally, we recommend greater community engagement to explain the reasons why policies are being pursued in particular communities. With that, I will end it.
Before I bring the mayor, I want to just provide a summary, if I may, put it in maybe managerial terms, some policy terms. If you look at it, and we were to look at now what has happened in Tampa, why you see the interest when I agreed to do the assessment is the outcomes were determined when a decision was made about how to respond to a legitimate crime problem a year or two ago. And so the value of this, the message we hope that will come very, very clear, and Tampa will be the model for this, is the need to collect data, to analyze data, to use data in making decisions on how to fight crime, enhance public safety, and deploy enforcement strategies. Because even despite the best intention, if the data is not used properly, you can have the disparate outcomes that we're talking about today. And we've learned time and time again that we didn't think there was an outcome, but I would say this, regardless of the intent of the disparity, if you're on the receiving end of it, it feels nonetheless painless, it's still very painful, and people still want to be treated with respect. So on one hand, I think this is a very powerful moment in that a department can learn through the data how to better deploy their resources, how to start doing some additional analysis to determine if what their presumptions are accurate, how to measure any program to prevent disparities in the future. In this sense, the lessons learned here, the report that you have will be shared with over 17,000 police department, sheriff's offices around the country. Because I have to stress from my perspective at the COPS office, this challenge, fighting crime, enhancing public safety, serving the community, making sure community police embrace diversity and not leave any segment disenfranchised, is not unique to Tampa. This is a national challenge. This is why the President's Task Force has made data collection so important. This is why we have the White House Police Data Initiative. This is why I'm standing here today, because I am strongly in belief with the progressive leadership of both former Police Chief Castor and Chief Ward right now, that Tampa can be the model. We can really show the country the value of data analysis. So yes, we have racial disparities. Yes, what the department thought they were doing turned out not to be the case. There is no justification for these racial disparities, and yes, changes must occur. That is called strong leadership. Now the question is, what are the next steps? What is the department going to do with the community, and how do we use this to advance this concept, not only in Tampa, but around the country, so that every community's voice is heard. This is a good exercise in the sense that the community was the first to bring this to the attention of the city. The city listened and asked for the federal government to help. And so we're here to provide that assistance, and I will tell you at the request of the chief, we will continue the assistance. In other words, instead of just giving the report and simply saying goodbye, the chief has asked us for continual technical assistance as he starts working to implement the recommendation, and as he, with the leadership of the mayor, starts building his own internal analysis capacity so that they can have the information necessary to evaluate programs before, during, and after they're implemented on behalf of the community. So with that, I would like to turn it over to the Honorable Mayor. Okay. Yes.
Director Davis and U.S. Attorney Bentley, thanks as always for being here. A particular word of thanks to the COPS program. A year ago when we started down this path, we said in no uncertain terms that we were going to be transparent. That we had no problem opening up our books, opening up our tactics, opening up the data, so that we could be a better police department, and with the expertise of the COPS program, we could have an independent look at what we were doing, to tell us whether or not it was a tactic that was working, whether it was a tactic that was appropriate, whether it was a tactic that was in keeping with the tradition of the Tampa Police Department, which certainly in my estimation, and I think by the measure of many people around the country, is one of the finest police departments in America. It is a department that has reduced crime over 50% in the last 10 years, and that results in a safer city and a community that is better because of their efforts. When former Chief Castor and I asked the COPS program to come in, we didn't have any reservations. We didn't put any restrictions on it. We didn't tell them what not to look at. We said, this is an issue that has been raised. Ladies and gentlemen, come in here, tell us what we're doing right, tell us what we're doing wrong, and give us a path to correct whatever deficiencies that we may have. I think what you heard from Director Davis was that while there were disparities, and we recognize that, acknowledge that, and acknowledge it from day one, there was no discriminatory practices. This was not a police tactic that was targeted at anybody of a specific race. It was targeted at criminals. So for us, we welcome this. We don't have any problem accepting this. We are thankful that they have given this to us and spent the time with us. Our job moving forward, and Chief Ward's job moving forward, is how we implement these recommendations to be a better police department. We're not ashamed of it. We embrace it. We have no problems doing and making this department better through whatever expertise that we can bring to bear. We are not a perfect police department. There is no such thing as a perfect police department. This is a department that gets up every day and does for us what most of us can't do for ourselves, and they should be honored for that. But we are not perfect, and we will continue to grow. We will continue to learn. We will continue to engender that affection in the community, because we all know those community relations are not something that we do at a press conference like this. It's something that we engage in every day, officer to community person, neighbor to neighbor. That is a constant, ever-growing process and ever-changing. We acknowledge that. So moving forward, we're going to take these recommendations and we're going to implement them. I mean, it's that simple. They are good recommendations. Many of them we've already started under the leadership of Chief Ward over the last year. Many of the things that have been highlighted in this, the shortcomings and the strengths, have already been addressed and will continue to be addressed as we as a department continue to grow. It's important for us. It's important for that relationship that we have with the community. It's important that we continue every day as a department and as a city to improve to recognize where we fall short, but to get up and go back at it that next day and make it better and better and better. We thank you for this. We know it's been a lot of work. We know it has not been without its controversy. The voices in this community that have spoken on both sides of the issue, and I will tell you, when you read this report, you will see that there are many in the community, I would say the majority, who honor the work of the Tampa Police Department, who want them in their neighborhoods, who understand exactly what they were doing, and they are appreciative for it because they are no longer prisoners in their own house. That being said, we can always get better, and we will. Chief Airport.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the Department of Justice and the COPS organization for coming down and assisting us as we work through this process. It's been a long year, one that we've been looking forward to. As I looked through the report, there were several recommendations that are highlighted today as well as in the report that we will address. When we started this process, one of the things that I said from the onset was that we would address these issues. And the recommendations that came out, we would take care of and act on immediately. So in very short order, we're going to look at these recommendations, assemble a team of professionals to help us work through this process. Saying that, I will tell you that we have, in my opinion, one of the best agencies in this country. These recommendations are only going to make us better. As we work to build our relationship with the community, this is something that I'm looking forward to. Thank you very much.
At this time, we will open it up for questions. As I stated before, when you get my attention and identify yourself, your media outlet, and to whom your questions directed towards. I do also want to mention, I noticed some folks that came in that are not members of the press. The Q&A is just for members of the media, credentialed media. So yeah, right here.
Chief Ward, Carson Chambers with ABC. Can you talk about some of the recommendations that you've already addressed in the past year, what you've been working on?
Well, one of the things that was outlined a couple minutes ago was that there was a way to capture information that kind of captured the ethnicities. Those processes are already in place. Those are things that we've addressed. We've always captured that information. It's how we were able to extract it. This is what was the issue. So